Extermination. They don't call it killing. They call it procedure. They call it protocol. They call it just doing the job. Language is the first weapon, because once you stop saying people, it becomes easier to stop seeing them. Targets, suspects, threats. Notice how none of those words breathe. None of those words have mothers waiting for them to come home. None of those words had a childhood photograph taped to a refrigerator door. None of those words had a laugh that filled a room. Language erases life long before violence arrives. Hands up doesn't look the same when fear decides the angle. A phone becomes a weapon the moment it starts recording truth. Because truth is dangerous to anyone who relies on silence to survive. Body cams blink on and off like morality with a switch. Convenient blindness, convenient darkness, convenient forgetting. Reports get written before blood dries, before families are notified, before the street is even washed clean, because paperwork is faster than accountability. They tell us, trust the process, but the process never bleeds. People do. The process never cries out in the street. The process never begs for breath. The process never leaves a mother standing in front of microphones trying to describe the sound of her world collapsing. Processes survive. People don't. Extermination never begins with bullets. It begins with permission. Permission to treat life like inconvenience. Permission to confuse authority with righteousness. Permission to erase context and call it order. History has seen this script before. It has worn different uniforms, spoken different languages, but the blueprint never really changes. First comes the language, then comes the fear, then comes the justification, then comes the violence, and afterward comes the explanation. Always an explanation, always a reason, always a narrative carefully crafted to make cruelty sound responsible. They say it's about safety, but safety never looks like this. Safety doesn't break into homes at dawn and leave children counting echoes. Safety doesn't mistake skin for suspicion. Safety doesn't see movement and assume danger. Safety doesn't fire first and investigate later. Safety doesn't choke the breath out of a human body while cameras roll and still call it procedure. Safety does not look like a knee resting on a neck long after the truth has stopped breathing. But fear can make cruelty feel justified. Bullies always panic when the phones come out, because documentation is a mirror they cannot edit, a mirror they cannot spin, a mirror that remembers. But mirrors only matter if people are willing to look. And history shows how often power turns away from its own reflection. Sometimes the footage is clear. Sometimes the truth is undeniable. Yet still, the machine moves slowly, very slowly. Slow enough for outrage to cool. Slow enough for attention to wander. Slow enough for the story to disappear from headlines. Justice delayed is often justice denied, and denial is the oxygen systems breathe. because systems rarely admit guilt. They adjust language. They hold press conferences. They promise reform. But reform without accountability is just delay wearing a hopeful mask. And masks have always been useful tools. They hide intention. They hide responsibility. They hide the quiet truth that extermination rarely looks like hatred. Most of the time, it looks like routine. Just another shift, just another report, just another name added to a list people will eventually stop reading. And when the people finally resist, when they push back against the weight pressing on their lungs, the narrative flips. Now you are violent. Now you are unruly. Now you are dangerous. Now you deserve what happens next. Because power is very skilled at rewriting the moment. The protest becomes the problem. The resistance becomes the crime. The anger becomes the threat. But anger is what pain looks like when it refuses to stay quiet. And quiet has been demanded for far too long. Extermination is never framed as cruelty. It's framed as necessity. The same word echoes through history: necessary. Necessary for order. Necessary for stability. Necessary for peace. But peace built on fear is not peace, it's control. And control has always required a target. History is full of those targets. Different faces, different eras, same justification, same permission, same silence. Because silence is the most reliable accomplice power has ever known. Silence signs the paperwork. Silence buries the evidence. Silence tells the next generation not to ask too many questions. But questions are dangerous. Questions crack open narratives. Questions expose contradictions. Questions force people to confront what they would rather ignore. And once people see, really see, the machinery behind the violence, it becomes harder to pretend this is all coincidence. Because extermination is never random. It follows patterns. Patterns of fear. Patterns of authority. Patterns of people who were taught that some lives are easier to erase than others. And every time the cycle repeats, the explanation sounds familiar: an accident, a misunderstanding, a tragic mistake. But tragedy is not supposed to repeat itself this often. At some point, repetition stops being tragedy and starts looking less like tragedy and more like design. And long after the sirens fade, long after the headlines move on, long after the cameras stop recording, the question remains: not whether the system made a mistake, but whether the system was doing exactly what it was designed to do. Because extermination does not require monsters, only permission. Permission to look away. Permission to justify. Permission to believe that someone else's life is collateral damage. And as long as that permission exists, the process will continue. Reports will be filed. Statements will be released. Language will be polished until brutality sounds responsible. Words like procedure, protocol, policy. But somewhere, someone is still asking the question power hopes no one says out loud. Not who pulled the trigger, But who created the system that keeps loading the gun? Because systems rarely break themselves. They continue quietly, efficiently, without interruption. And every time the explanation sounds the same: accident, misunderstanding, tragic mistake, the question grows louder. Because mistakes don't repeat this consistently. At some point, we have to stop calling it error and start calling it design.